Okay, so this training section is going to be about sexual assault on college campuses specifically, which I'm sure you can imagine is extra important for us here in the Gunnison Valley since the presence of Western is so important to our community. So we're going to talk about what makes a sexual assault different when it's on a college campus, how it's a little bit different working with college students, and then some specific issues and considerations about working with victims on college campuses. So first, here's some statistics about sexual assault on campuses. Institutions of higher education are pretty notorious for having elevated rates of sex assault. So you can see it's pretty common for a young woman to be assaulted during her college career. They usually know their offender. This college is a hotbed of acquaintance rape, which is the most common anywhere, but especially in college. It's friends at parties, things like that. And as the final statistic shows, a lot of them happen during a date. So, very, again, acquaintance rape, date rape, not the typical, stranger in the bushes type rape, but this is someone that the victim knew, was interacting with intentionally, and then took a turn for the worse, with ending with an assault. Here's some more statistics, just showing how common it is. It's more likely to happen off campus. So this is an important point to remember later in this presentation. We're going to talk about Title IX rules, which are rules which regulate how a college approaches the investigation and adjudication of sexual assaults. So remember this, that 2/3 of them happen off campus rather than on. And less than 5% are reported to law enforcement, and then in the majority of the incidents, the victim doesn't even tell, or does tell someone, but usually a friend, but not really anyone in authority or in law enforcement or anything like that. So here's some stuff about why college campuses are different when we're talking about sex assault. So the biggest part of this is that there's something called Title IX, which any school, K through 12 and colleges and universities, any one of those schools that receives federal funding, which the vast majority of public institutions do, they have to adhere to Title IX requirements. These requirements have been modified a lot over the years, and there is not a bullet point on here, but there was actually just a very recent modification that happened in May of 2020. So during the Obama administration, the administration put out something called a Dear Colleague letter that was telling basically all the schools that they needed to abide by Title IX, they needed to have a Title IX coordinator, they needed to adopt Title IX procedures that would promptly address any complaints that the school received. 2 years later, there was some further clarification to just sort of clarify some definitions and ideas and procedures inside Title IX. And then a little bit further in 2015, they did some more clarification around what a person in that position must do and how they need to adhere to the requirements. In 2020, I think we will talk a little bit more about this later, but in 2020, just a couple months ago from when I'm recording this, May 2020, the Trump administration, Department of Education under Betsy DeVos, put out some new rules that, for right now, I'll just say very much rolled back a lot of the progressive policies that had been put in place to protect victims on campuses, and the 2020 version kind of rolled that back for the sake of due process to the perpetrator or respondent and to reduce burden on the institution. But we'll talk about that more later. So then there is also the Clery Act, which is about reporting campus crimes in general, and it kind of guides universities on how they need to go about responding to crime reports on campuses. It's supposed to provide, victims' rights and protections against retaliation and disciplinary measures that can be implemented on campus. So that kind of provides some further guidance about if something is classified as a crime on campus. In 2013, the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, was reauthorized and had this provision called Campus Save, which had some new reporting requirements and definitions, new discipline requirements, some victim reporting options and protections for victims, standards for investigation, just some further guidance again to help colleges and universities understand better how to respond to this particular crime and situation. And then there was the White House Task Force several years ago, had the Not Alone initiative that requires, campus climate surveys are now mandatory. It requires sex assault prevention education and some further guidelines on responding to survivors. And all of those, the Clery Act, VAWA, the Not Alone, all of those are meant to dovetail with Title IX and to support it and provide more guidance around it, because Title IX covers a vast array of issues related to sex-based discrimination, and sex assault is only a piece of it. So these other laws and initiatives are created to provide more guidance than what the Title IX itself has specific to sex assault. You can see in the little graphic we have there a little brief blurb about what Title IX is. It was implemented in the 70s, and again, it just requires schools that receive federal funding to have Title IX in place, which basically is to prevent discrimination based on sex. So it's, equal opportunities in sports, equal opportunities in education, and then the sex assault piece. So a little bit of info about why college students are different than folks that we might come across in our work from the general population. So you can see this data from CSU. A lot of students coming in as freshmen have already either experienced themselves or had a very close friend or someone experienced a sex assault. So they are, unfortunately, have been exposed to the issue, most likely. But we have to remember they're also still very young individuals, and this is the first time many of them have maybe been on their own. They're, you're at that age, you're learning how to, behave responsibly and healthily. There's a lot of experimentation and new social experiences that they maybe have not had before they went to college. And, for folks who are living on campus, everyone's all in the dorms together. And Gunnison is a small town, so even if they're not on campus, for us specifically, they're still going to be, pretty much in close proximity to each other. For a lot of universities, there's There's Greek life, which plays a big role in both sex assault, but then also just sort of creating a culture of kind of like gender-based identities on campuses. And then there are athletic teams or other clubs maybe that may be gender specific, that again kind of just reinforce those cultures around some gender stereotypes. We will see more of this embodied in the film The Hunting Ground, which will be something that you'll watch as part of this training. So you can kind of see more about what I mean when I'm talking about that through that documentary. Some additional campus considerations are things like mandatory reporting. So a lot of folks who are employed by a school, by a university, are what's called a mandatory reporter. I think pretty much everyone employed by Western, except for like the counselors who are on Western's campus but aren't actually Western employees, are mandatory reporters. So what that means is if a student or even a fellow faculty member probably discloses some kind of Title IX violation, a sex assault or sexual harassment, then that to a university staff or faculty, that person is then legally required to make a report to the Title IX coordinator. So it's important that students know this in case they don't want that information passed up the chain to the Title IX coordinator. The Title IX coordinator then can get in touch with the student and kind of navigate where they want to go from there. That doesn't mean there's an automatic, like, full-blown investigation on the behalf of the Title IX coordinator, but that information is going to go at least as far as the person in that role. Which some students really want that, and some students definitely don't. So that's where Project Hope can come in as a confidential source of support. We're not required to make any kind of Title IX reporting, so we can help them without having to involve the university in any way. And we can also help if a student does decide to go through a Title IX proceeding of any kind. Project Hope can still help support them through that. There are rules in Title IX about timely warnings to the student body. It's a little bit ambiguous, and there's really only the university gets to choose what they call a timely warning, which is when there's a person who may be a threat to campus public safety. So if there were reports of an active shooter on campus, they would need to do a timely warning where you get those like emergency notifications. And they can also activate this in the case of if they were to realize that there was like a rapist or someone that was prowling around campus, and there had been reports of it, and maybe someone had been attacked. This is also a situation where the campus may issue a timely warning, but it's really up to the university on how and when they want to do that. And then, as I mentioned, a university with the permission of the student will investigate a Title IX complaint, and there are many avenues on how that can go. It can be, there's like a formal process or an informal process with different levels of investigation, and some of that is up to the student on what they want to pursue, and some of it, you know, to a certain degree is required by the law, the Title IX law. Adjudication of it is largely up to the university on how they approach like student conduct violations, including Title IX violations. So again, a lot of that is just sort of up to each individual college and how they go about doing it, which can be problematic because some universities may be very loose about how they do that, and some may be more strict, and so it's just kind of difficult to navigate. So a little bit more about mandatory reporting. Again, a lot of this is up to each institution on how they interpret and apply and implement the regulations about mandatory reporting. I believe, like I said, on Western's campus, pretty much everybody is a mandatory reporter, even RAs, peer mentors, staff, and faculty. I think almost everybody is a mandatory reporter. We have had a few instances where there's someone who's maybe an RA or even a staff member, someone employed by Western, who is also a volunteer advocate with Project Hope. And when they are in a role as a Project Hope volunteer, they are exempt from the mandatory reporting. But if someone discloses to them while they are wearing their Western hat, their Western role, then they're a mandatory reporter in that context. So it's important for students to know that there are other confidential resources. Like I said, Project Hope is the big one. The counselors, whether it's the ones that are on campus or not on campus, are confidential. And if they needed any kind of legal support, of course, attorneys always have client privilege, so they're confidential as well. So a little bit more about this timely warning thing. So this is required under that Clery Act that we talked about earlier. This is when there is a crime or a criminal poses a threat to the public safety on campus, and it sends out those emergency alerts, whether it's a text or an email or a phone call. And again, there's that sort of difficulty in determining what a threat to public safety means, and getting this kind of alert can be rather alarming in today's day and age. So college campuses maybe want to be really careful about when they send these out so as not to alarm everyone. There's some anecdotal information out there that indicates that some college campuses may be really hesitant to put one of these out in the case of like a serial rapist or something like that, which is unfortunate. I don't think that situation has arisen on Western's campus to my knowledge, so I don't know how Western would respond to that specifically, but they are required to do it when there is a threat to public safety as determined by the university. So a little bit about how these are adjudicated on campus. This proceeding is completely different than any kind of legal proceeding that you would pursue through normal law enforcement in the court system. This is specific to only on campus. There is what's called a preponderance of evidence standard, which is different than legal proceedings. Fortunately, this part of Title IX was mostly kept intact from the 2020 changes. So it's basically a lower standard of evidence than what the legal system requires when you are pressing criminal charges in court from like a sex assault. Like you would want like DNA evidence and any other physical evidence and a pretty high standard of evidence there. When you do this through Title IX, it's not as high. You don't need to present DNA evidence to your college officials. It's maybe witness accounts or your own story. It's a much lower standard, which is good for victims because then they can get some sort of justice through the Title IX procedure without having to come up with their own like DNA evidence or whatever. So survivors, depending on which avenue of Title IX is pursued, survivors may be able to be present at hearings, listening to, or if they don't want to be present, it could maybe be recorded and listened to later. There's a new rule now that both the complainant and the respondent can have an advisor present with them who can also question the other party. So a survivor or the complainant can be there with their advisor. They can submit a victim impact statement. There's a few ways that the survivor can be involved in the adjudication process. Both parties can appeal the decision, so if the respondent or the complainant doesn't like how it went, they do have the right to appeal. Currently, the Western just hired a new Title IX coordinator. Her name is Shelby, and she is the new point of contact for any Title IX violations. So faculty and staff can play an important role. They can, if a student has a particularly close relationship with a professor, they can be really supportive through a Title IX process. The way Title IX works is there are investigators who are, other faculty and staff on the campus. So they are supposed to be neutral investigators, but even in that role, they can still be, compassionate to the survivor. And they can just be important for both the complainant and respondent. It can be, again, a little tricky with the confidential resources. If you want a professor to support you through this, you will need to know that they will have to report, and it's just kind of something to keep in mind if they want to involve a professor or a trusted staff member. We just want to remind folks, this is training that you would have gotten in other trainings about sort of trauma-informed advocacy. But we want to remember that just the same as any other reporter of a sex assault, that a college student may also be slow to report. Maybe their memories are kind of jumbled, and we just want to be mindful of that. We want to, of course, try to avoid any kind of victim blaming. I think the drunk college girl is an easy target for victim blaming. Why were you by yourself? How much did you have to drink? Did you have any other drugs? All of those kinds of things. That's an easy target for us to do victim blaming. So we just want to really be careful when we're talking with college students who have experienced a sex assault to try to avoid those type of questions. And again, understanding that it's often going to be a known perpetrator, is maybe someone that they, like I said, they went on a date with, or they had been dating for a little bit. All those situations, we want to be mindful that they can still be victims of sex assault even in those situations. And we want to still have a trauma-informed response and be empowering and validating of feelings and helping them just be informed in what their options are going forward. I really like this. Well, that sounds weird. I don't like this quote because it's awful, but I think that it is a good way to sort of visualize the prevalence of sexual assault. If we could hear every time someone experienced this, that it would just be a deafening sound of all of the people who have been victim of sex assault, and we would do everything that we could in our power to stop it. So I think it's particularly important, again, on college campuses due to the higher rate of prevalence that we see there. Okay, so this is where we're going to talk a little bit about the changes. This PowerPoint is a little out of date since these new ones just got rolled out. We didn't have time to update our PowerPoint to reflect it visually, but we will talk about it. So a lot of changes have happened to Title IX in the last several years. I told you about the Title IX letter in 2011, 2013. And so a lot of students maybe are having questions again. They had questions when that happened. And now that we are just had a new rollout of rules. Students who were mid-process would maybe have more of these questions of what's going to happen to my case if they were in the middle of a proceeding. So just to talk a little bit more about the changes that happened. So Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos felt that the most recent recommendations by the Dear Colleague letter was harmful to students because she felt that a lot of students were being falsely accused and were being denied due process. So she put out some proposed rule changes in fall of 2018, I believe, and then the rules went to a public comment process, which is when anyone in the public can submit a comment for or against the proposed changes. And I think like 150,000 comments or something were received on this. And those were taken into a certain degree of consideration, and the new rules were revised and adjusted, and they were rolled out in May 2020 with a deadline of compliance of August 2020. So this upcoming fall, as I'm recording this, these new rules will need to be ready to be implemented. Some brief info on some of the changes. So remember earlier in this presentation, and I said, remember how many assaults happen off campus, and that was basically like 2/3. So under the new rules, schools must dismiss any complaints of sexual misconduct that occur outside of campus-controlled buildings or educational activities. So those 2/3 of assaults that happen off campus, schools no longer are able to do anything about those. There's now, I think I mentioned it briefly, colleges can allow a live cross-examination by the advisor for each party, and the complainant can, as can the complainant and respondent can choose who that is. So this may be pretty uncomfortable for possibly both, depending on who's doing the questions, but if it's done by someone who's untrained, it could be pretty traumatizing. There used to be a 60-day requirement for investigations to be completed, so to avoid having a student be dragged through a very lengthy process, and this rule removes that time limit. So now a student may be forced to endure a process that takes like the entire school year, potentially, if the college chooses not to sort of stick with that requirement. Colleges they have some flexibility there. They can maintain that, but they're no longer required to. The definition of sexual harassment has been narrowed by this new rule. There's an allowance for unregulated mediation, which again could be rather traumatizing for survivors. Mediation that is supervised and facilitated by a trained mediator can be extremely restorative for both complainant and respondent, but unmediated or unregulated can be has the potential to be very upsetting and traumatizing. It reduces the school's obligation to act against sexual harassment as long as they can prove that they are not being deliberately indifferent, which is a rather subjective term. You can only file a complaint against someone who attends your university. So if a Western student went to a football game down at Adams State and was assaulted by an Adams State student, they have no recourse of filing a Title IX complaint in that situation. So those are some brief changes to the rules. So you can see how they may be a little less favorable to victims. Unfortunately, you can see this quote by someone from the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault that says there may be room for improvement in Title IX, but it doesn't mean dismantle the whole system. So we, as victim advocates, we certainly recognize that the system wasn't perfect, but that we didn't want to completely destroy what had been put in place to protect victims and allow for a process to seek justice. Which certainly Title IX is not destroyed, but it did get hamstrung a little bit as far as victim rights goes with the new rules rolled out in 2020. So at this point, I am turning the presentation over, so to speak, to this film called The Hunting Ground. I mentioned it earlier. It's a documentary about sexual assault on college campuses. I think it was released in 2015, so it's relatively new. As I said, a lot of changes have happened in Title IX since then. But regardless of that, the film still gives a really good look at what students may be facing when they go to college and if they have a Title IX complaint that they want to make. So this film is on DVD, and we will make sure to provide it to you so that you can watch. So you can go ahead and pause this training. There's a little bit afterwards, so make sure you come back to this video after you watch the documentary. So I'm going to go ahead and pause my talking while you pause the video, and come on back and we'll wrap up. So as we look at this fun cartoon, just some updates and thoughts about The Hunting Ground. I hope that it was informative. I know for me, I take something new away from it every time I watch it. A couple updates, like I said, those two women who are kind of leading the charge, Annie and Andrea, from UNC Chapel Hill. In 2018, after a 5-year investigation and proceeding, UNC Chapel Hill was finally found in violation of Title IX. So it took them 5 years, but they did finally get that ruling. And then in regards to Jameis Winston, the football player from Florida, he was suspended. He went on to play in the NFL. He was suspended in 2018 for 3 NFL games, after having been accused of assaulting a female Uber driver. So, the way that that student who came out accused him in college, the way she was treated, the way people reacted, the way the college reacted, and essentially, let him get off without much consequence. He did go on to assault someone else, and his punishment was to get suspended for 3 games. And it took like 1.5 years or something for the NFL to come up with that. He assaulted the person in March of 2016, and then the suspension didn't come down until, I think, prior to the 2018 season. So those are just some updates about that film. And then just as far as the film goes, just some food for thought. Did that film surprise you? Were you aware prior to this training in the film of how prevalent sexual violence is on college campuses? Does it change the way you think about it at all? Do you feel inspired to act or do anything? Do you feel like sexual violence is addressed in your community? If you're a college student watching this, how do you feel about how that's going on campus? Is there adequate support offered for folks who want to report, or who, regardless of reporting, are survivors? Were you surprised by a lot of the responses that students got in that film about they were doubted or disbelieved or even reprimanded by their university officials when they reported? Um, like I said, was that a surprise? How would you expect them to respond? Um, can you think of any other crime or violation that a student might report that would be met with that kind of reaction? Do you have any thoughts about the link that's made between the profitability of universities and their willingness to investigate Title IX conduct violations and to support students who make those complaints? Do you think there's a conflict of interest there, and how might we avoid that? There's also a lot of survivors mentioned not wanting to tell their parents, and maybe they still never have. Why do you think that might be? How might parents, have conversations with students before they go to college to maybe try and keep that door open in case it does happen? And just, I talk about this film all the time with anyone who is willing to listen to me. So just maybe think about if this might be something that you will take with you and carry forward and share and spread awareness of this issue. So I hope, again, that you found that film informative. I know it's difficult to watch. It definitely is upsetting and makes me angry, but I hope that it was informative and that you learned something and had some good takeaways with it. But with that is the end of our training on campus sexual assault. There will be links. Any links that were from this presentation will be below in the description of this video on YouTube, and there will be a quiz, and you can of course ask Project Hope staff any questions that came up for you while you were watching.